All right. I'm so excited to have a guest with us today. This is Cynthia Greene, and I think we're just going to hop right in about. We're going to be chatting today about farm to school and farm to early childhood. So, Cynthia, if you can just kind of introduce yourself and then tell us what is farm to school and early childhood.
Sure, happy to do so. Thanks, April. So I'm Cynthia Greene. I work with Shelburne Farms. My current title is Farm to Early Childhood Partnership Coordinator. And really what I'm doing there is exactly what it sounds like. I'm reaching out and engaging different partners in farm to school and farm to early childhood across Vermont, and across New England and nationally, actually. So lots of opportunities there. My background, though, I'm an early educator. I arrived at this through early education, as a teacher, director, someone who, loves to garden and loves to cook, someone who's familiar with Head Start, different types of regulations, including STARS in Vermont, QRIS. So I feel like I have a really good perspective, grounded perspective of what it's like to be a teacher and an early educator and a program director in Vermont. And then I would say, gravitated toward farm to early childhood because it met many of my own personal career goals and intersected beautifully with early childhood. So that's a little bit about me.
That's awesome.
And
I
what is farm to early childhood? Oh, sorry, go
Yeah.
ahead.
No, I was going to say, I was just getting like a little bit of context. I think the first time we met, you and Jed had came over from Shelburne Farms to do a program for us here in St. Johnsbury. And it was
Yes.
just so wonderful to like be amongst so I grew up in a greenhouse and have a lot of agricultural background, and small business in a greenhouse with my mom's business. But just to think about like this world of agriculture and food systems and how we get children connected into farms is to me just really exciting. And I think I always had my own aspirations of owning a farm. And then I went and realized how much work it is to own a farm. But I love working with children. And so bringing farming and gardening and food into our classroom is just a great segue. So when someone's talking about farm to school or farm to early childhood, what does that mean or what does that look like?
Sure. Again, I'll be describing what this means to me, what I think it looks like. But what I will say, the lovely piece about farm to school and early childhood is really, April, they're a flexible group of strategies. And really the idea is to leverage sort of the educational practices and the food purchasing habits of early childhood sites. And to do that in order to enrich the connections children, families, and staff have with fresh, nutritious food, local food producers, food systems, and then, of course, to learn a little bit about where food comes and nutrition education and what food does to us. We always like to say, I hear Jed say this all the time when you were talking about St. Johnsbury, every time we eat, we should thank a farmer because somewhere that food came from someone who's working with their hands in a very often under some stress, right? And physical conditions, as you said. So always thank a farmer.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would say what farm to early childhood looks like, or farm to school looks like. In New England, we often frame farm to early childhood and farm to school as the 3C model. And the 3Cs incorporate the classroom, which is where we access those experiential learning opportunities through curriculum to help children learn about food systems, nutrition education, big ideas of sustainability, whatever early educators want to be investigating with young children. The second C might be the cafeteria or the kitchen in early childhood. And that's really around access to nutritious foods, hopefully local food, exposure through either cooking or taste testing or eating different foods and menus for snacks and what have you. So exposure to actual nutritious food. And then the third C would be community, which is where we really talk about building connections for a whole variety of reasons. I think one of the lovely aspects that I take away from farm to early childhood is its ability to create social connections,
Mhm.
support social emotional development, thinking about who's in our community and how we engage and care for one another. And so that third C around community is community can be big C, little c. It could be your classroom. It could be your early childhood program. It could be the entire town where your program is located. It could be the whole state of Vermont. So I think there's lots of opportunity to think about what farm to early childhood means to us as individuals, what our values are, and how we might want to investigate and play with farm to early childhood through those sort of the 3C lens, if you will.
For sure. And the very first exposure I had to farm to school was in 2011. And we had a week-long institute where they came and worked with my children's elementary school. So I participated in this week-long institute, not as an educator, but as a parent, and really thinking about like, wow, how can we improve the food that my children's school is served? And it was just really exciting to hear about that potential. And then when I started to work again full time in a public school, I was at a school and we applied for a farm to school grant and we got it. And it was at that time, I think it was called it was $20,000. I think it was called like the implementation grant was
Yes,
the names have
correct.
changed.
They have.
They evolved, but it was like it was a sizable enough grant where we could really think about how can we do this and make it sustainable, because sometimes we write grants and it's like it's enough to put in a raised bed, which is awesome, and that's a first step. But I was at that school and farm to school looked like one way there, and then for the last 4 years I've been working at a different elementary school as the public preschool teacher, and we have a farm to school coordinator. Her position, it's part-time, but it's part of our regular, part of our regular budget. So, we
Right.
have a part-time farm to school coordinator who does work within the classroom, does support within the cafeteria, and, operates these some of the most beautiful school gardens I've ever seen. And it's like, it is a part of the culture of this school that I work in. But I know with educators that I work with around the country, they're like, what? How did you get there? And I think that's, to me, it really is all about advocacy. It's not because this one elementary school was by themselves, but that we have this pretty robust system, I feel like, that's been developed in Vermont. So can maybe you give us a little bit of the origin story? I mean, we don't need all of the granular detail, but it didn't just
Sure.
magically happen that now in
It did
2023,
not.
it took some time.
It did. And I have to say, so Vermont is really fortunate. We have a long history actually with farm to school. In fact, I think it's fair to say to a great extent, a lot of folks, partners nationally, sort of look to Vermont as kind of the originator of farm to school. And certainly Senator Patrick Leahy was an incredible supporter. And so what I would say is some really creative minds got together probably at least 20 years ago now, and we're really thinking about working farms, looking at the working landscape of Vermont, thinking about these big ideas of sustainability and where food comes from, and recognizing that I think as technology has advanced, we as society, and certainly I think our children as well, can become further removed from natural
Mhm.
settings. And I think, sort of fast forward, so there was this interest in building some sort of programming that was tied to educational standards and educational outcomes for children and youth, and I would even say adults, that also have the potential to long-term impact wellness and healthy
Mhm.
behaviors. So there's a health component to this. I think in Vermont, we have a historical agrarian society, and so there's this interest in keeping local dollars local, excuse me. So thinking about local economy, and so I feel like farm to school has always been born out of, at least my understanding, out of these sort of cross-sector
Mhm.
interests in supporting communities at large to be vibrant and diverse and connected. And so And so farm to school started, is what I would say. I will fast forward a little bit. We had the Razo McLaughlin Act, Farm to School Act was created. And in 2017, that act was updated to finally include early childhood, which was fantastic. Right, I know. So that meant in 2018, that fiscal year 2018 was the first year that the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets Farm to School and Early Childhood Grants program, and there are a series of grants under that. You talked about a couple, became open, and early childhood programs were eligible to apply. And that kind of just really started farm to early childhood in a new way. There had, again, sort of been, folks had been working on it in the background, but I think access to resources, as you indicated, was huge. When early childhood programs could apply for these resources, then they needed technical assistance and professional learning opportunities. So that kickstarted that whole piece. We have, 4 sort of primary organizations in Vermont. Children Farms is one that can support professional learning around curriculum and curriculum integration. Northeast Organic Farming Association is another of the technical assistance partners that supports folks around access to nutritious foods and farmers markets and farmers and producers in that system. Vermont Garden Network supports technical assistance and training around gardens. And then our Hunger Free Vermont folks help around child nutrition programs. Either if you are not operating a child adult care food program, you can still gain technical assistance and support around thinking about policies, engagement with families around food. So there's lots of technical assistance there. And so these actions, these accesses to resources in 2018, along with the need for professional learning and technical assistance about how do we do this? What is this? Why are we going to do this? How do we do this? How do we think about our program's values and how we want to operate, and how farm to school and early childhood might support those values. That's what really sort of has catapulted us in the last several years. And it's been a really lovely, I think, expansion. Partners have come together to get larger grants, both federal and Centers for Disease Control grants that have supported. We now have a Vermont Farm to Early Childhood Coalition. That coalition is part of our broader Vermont Farm to Early Childhood Network. And what I would say to early educators or folks thinking about this is that that body is open, anyone is welcome, but we are working on figuring out, how do we integrate farm to early childhood into our early childhood systems? How do we ensure that you have the resources you need, the opportunities for professional learning, the money to expand or start a child nutrition program if you want? And so we're figuring out those systems pieces so that you don't have to, is the idea. It'll take us a little while to do all this. But how are we integrating this with, for instance, early educator teacher relicensure requirements with the Agency of Education? Does our professional learning align with that? Do our resources really help offset or complement the expansion or inclusion of a child adult care food program in a program? So that's a little bit about sort of advocacy and how we are where we are now, which is, I think, working both to provide resources for boots on the ground, I would say, for those early educators or those program directors who have interest in wanting to, what is this? How do we get involved and provide that? At the same time, there's a group of us working on untangling some systems and some resources so that it's an easier adjustment, if you will, or an easier way to incorporate farm to early childhood approaches.
Yeah, I think to me, it's like every time I kind of go on to the website and look for resources, I'm always blown away at the volume, both not just the volume, because you can make lots of things, but the quality of them. And so our food service director at the public school that I teach at, she knew I was going to the Farm to School Summit a few weeks ago, and she's like, "Tell them I'm using the recipes. Tell them that," and I'm like, I know, like it is
fantastic.
You're making the tools that make it easier for educators to actually implement it. And I think that, to me, it's like, you're right. Like, we do eat every time that we're eating, we should be thanking, a farmer. And every time that I'm eating with my students, I'm thinking, what kinds of conversations can I have with kids about food? And so even, it's not a scripted lesson, but it's like, that's interesting. That texture's different than the last time, that we had oranges. And, I just find that there's so much that we can do just as those incidental kinds of learning. And it's like we're sitting down for meals anyway. Why not bring food education
Exactly.
in and talking with them? And I think sometimes it's like, I know I took one of the courses from that Jed was teaching. I've actually done lots of different workshops with you guys over the years, but one of them was taught. It was an article we had to read. It was a it was a one credit course I took with Jed, but there was an article in there that talked about the lifelong food preferences of children, or sorry, lifelong
Yes.
preferences of people, and
People.
how that happens in early childhood. And I read that and I was like, I've been doing this work for a long time, and now I have like this sense of urgency. Like it's not okay that we're just eating chicken nuggets and applesauce with ranch, and dip everything in
Right.
ranch. But to think of like the positive ways that we can have these exposures. And so I talk a lot with families and really encouraging them to use the food program that we have at school. We have
Right.
universal meals now. Like it's not, in Vermont, we have universal meals.
So
I
exciting.
have the advantage in that my preschool is in a public school. So we have universal meals, and we're not quite there yet for childcare centers, but there's
Right.
hope. Um, but I just
Part of
think,
the systems the coalition is working on, just FYI.
yes,
Someday in the future, we hope.
it's
Anyway.
we're aware of what the problems are, but I know when we were the advocacy that Hunger Free Vermont was doing around even at early childhood legislative day, March 2023, like they were
Right.
like, we need people to speak up about this. And it's like universal meals is really important, and we can eliminate the stigma of eating school lunch when it's freely accessible to everyone. And just that idea, to me, sometimes I think advocacy people think about like you have to have a sign and you're on a picket line and you're like got a megaphone. And it's like, no, it might be sending an email to your legislator. It might be talking, it might be sitting down to lunch and talking with your local legislators about why universal meals is important. And at that early childhood legislative day, I sat down with one of my legislators who really wasn't on board with universal meals. And so we had an
Interesting.
interesting conversation, and it was like, I felt a little like bristly about it. But then after the conversation and that person left, I was like, okay, but I said my piece, and then I quickly went to the table to the Hunger Free Vermont and was like, this is what I did. What else should I have said? Like that's that part of, you don't have to
Yeah.
go at advocacy alone. We have resources and people that we can tap into. But thinking, just not to totally change the train of thought, but thinking about if
Sure.
a lot of my students who are either new to the workforce or are just getting started in thinking about farm to school, who might not be at that point of being able to apply for a grant, what are some of those first steps that you think about in, how do we start to bring this into our programs?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And actually, I'll just tap on a little bit about advocacy. Sometimes advocacy is just investigating for your own knowledge. Even if you're not ready to talk to any others, like understanding a little bit more about farm to school or farm to early childhood. So, perfect segue into where to get started. I think, you know, honestly, and you alluded to the fact that there are lots of resources, like there is a volume of resources out there, and it can be sometimes overwhelming. So, my suggestion to folks, if they're interested in farm to school and early childhood, a really great starting point is to actually do some self reflection and journaling. Why are you interested in this?
Mhm.
What values do you personally hold around food, around nutrition, around agriculture, around education? Like, what are your big values? What are your program values? And to think about that a little bit and marinate in that, because um, again, farm to school and early childhood is so approachable. There are so many different and unique ways to implement farm to school and early childhood approaches that are meaningful to you, that you can really do this from a values aligned perspective. So if you know what your values are around these big ideas, then I would say after that, go do a little investigation. One of my first stops has always been the Vermont Farm to School and Early Childhood Network website. If you just want that quick overview of what is Farm to School, who's doing this work, who are some of the players in Vermont, where might I find a regional connector? So if I'm in the Northeast Kingdom, who I'm going to connect with up there is going to be different than if I'm in Brattleboro and connecting with a regional partner there. And that website has that information. It also has some fairly carefully selected and curated resources for farm to school and early childhood. So if you are interested in some curriculum resources, you could find them on that website. And I do say carefully curated, because we've tried to pare resources down so that they're appropriate by audience, so that they have applicable and relevant, timely information. They aren't outdated. So I think, thinking about your values, taking a look at some initial websites, thinking about how you're arriving to farm to early childhood, and then thinking about what you need next. So what do you need? If you're beyond that initial information, you're like, I really need professional learning. Check out the Shelburne Farms website. We have professional learning for early educators and educators, all educators, frankly, adult learning in general. If you're like, oh, I really need some resources and some tips on gardening, I would suggest go to kidsgardening.org. They're a Vermont-based organization. They have amazing curriculum all ready to go. You can download it around gardening. They have some tips. They even have grant resources for gardening implementation. So, gardening, go to kidsgardening.com or kidsgardening.org, excuse me. There are a few other sites that I think are great. Certainly, if you're looking for how to get connected to producers and farmers in Vermont, the Northeast Organic Farming Association, also known as NOFA Vermont, is a great website. Lots of fantastic tools where you can look up on a map where your local farmer is, who's at the farmer's market, that kind of thing, whether or not they accept certain types of benefits, like EBT cards, that sort of thing, for your families. And then finally, the final website that I would suggest, this might be sort of concentric circles in my own mind, is the National Farm to School Network website. That website really curates from across the country. There are some really fabulous resources out there. It can become overwhelming, but if you also want to know what's going on nationally with farm to school or farm to early childhood, you want to know what other states are doing, you want to know what's happening with federal legislation or federal bills like the Farm Bill that might impact farm to school and early childhood, you can really find out some great information on their website.
That's awesome. Would you talk, maybe one of my last questions, because I don't want to make, I want to make this too long, though I could talk to you all day long, let's just say, is can you describe one of the trainings that I really loved? Like I said, I've done a lot of different, I'm a Shelburne Farms groupie. I'm like,
we appreciate that.
I know. But the cultivating joy and wonder, it's not just farm to school. It has other natural science and things, but I love the curriculum guide and then also the summer training that usually happens in the month of July. Can you describe that for us?
Sure. Describing Shelburne Farms Cultivating Joy and Wonder. I guess I would describe this course as an in-person, week-long immersion experience for early educators. More specifically, this is really geared toward younger age groups of kids, maybe through grade 3. But educators who want to come together and think about the big ideas of sustainability and do so with some like-minded people, like-minded educators. It is an incredibly interactive and engaging week. You are on the Shelburne Farms campus. That's where it's hosted for a week. You're housed there, you're well fed there, and you engage in almost every aspect of our campus and of the farm. So, you'll go to the dairy, you'll go to the market garden, you might go to the sugar shack, even if it's not an operation, you'll talk with the producers and the dairy folk, and you'll talk with people who are doing this work. And while you're there, you'll investigate some of these big ideas of sustainability and have ample time to reflect and talk with other educators about how they're thinking about and implementing in the classroom, teaching these concepts to children. I think, there's a lot of activities that I think people can take away with them to immediately try in their classrooms if they're going back to their classrooms. And the idea is that it's not exhaustive. This is an opportunity to really explore, and it's open whether you know a lot about sustainability or know very little about sustainability, or a lot about nature and place-based education and working outdoors with kids, or very little. It's for folks across the country. So whether you're in rural settings or urban settings, it's equally applicable. And I would say our staff educators, Jed and Hannah in the recent past, are so skilled at really incorporating those diverse settings and those diverse perspectives, honoring them and incorporating information that will help you bring your learning back to your programs. So it's immersive. I think I would leave folks with that. And everyone walks away and says it's a game changer. And I will fully admit that I took the course myself when I first started at Shelburne Farms. They gave me access to it, and it really was a game changer for me too.
Yeah. Well, I took it back in 2014, and I remember kind of going into it like, oh, I already know all this stuff. I grew up in a greenhouse. I, ran a holistic health center and was, did this and that. And I had like lots of things, and I had already started a nature preschool program. I was like, whatever, but I do need some hours, so let me go. But honestly, it was one of the best weeks. I felt so energized and learned so much and realized how much more I wanted to learn. And I feel like I give the best commercials for that training, because I'm like, oh yeah, no, I teach a lot of workshops, I teach college courses, but you should check out Cultivating Joy and Wonder. In fact, you can get the book for free. You go on their website, the whole thing's there for you, and it has activity ideas, and it's organized around sustainability, and it's like, and people are like, do you work for them? No, I'm a fan. I'm a fan.
It is pretty special. It is pretty special, but it's a taste. And that's what we want. We want it to spark inspiration. So folks, continue to investigate and learn about this. The other quick thing I didn't mention is, don't be deterred if you look online and you see a price tag. We have scholarships that are often available to defray costs. So I want to make sure that's out there. And the course can be offered for either continuing education units, like basically training hours, or you could take it for graduate credit if you have an early educator license and are looking for credits for relicensure. So there are a couple of formats, there are a couple of cost options, and then we try to offset that with scholarship as well.
That's so awesome. There's even a micro credentialing. Like if you get really
There
into
is.
it, I've looked at that so many times that I'm like, oh yes. And then I go,
There
oh,
is.
I have my own family and I'm supposed to be spending time with them. But it's just so exciting to see the evolution and how much Farm to School has grown. I know it's been around for, probably 20 some years, but I've been following it at least for the last, I don't know, 12. And, I feel like, there's grown so much, and we know how much we still have yet to do. But I just appreciate you being here. Did you have any like last words that you wanted to share, words of wisdom or such?
No, I would say don't be afraid to jump in, do a little investigation. And I will at least honor in Vermont the partners that I mentioned. So Vermont Garden Network, Hunger Free Vermont, Northeast Organic Farming Association in Shelburne, Vermont, Shelburne Farms, Vermont. Like if you just pick up the phone and call us. Like if you get stuck, like we're here, that we will always pick up the phone and try to help folks navigate if they're looking for a particular resource. And there's so many ways to engage and so many access points. Find something that you really value, that you're really interested in, and then do a little investigation and see what that looks like in your classroom.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much for being with us. I so appreciate you hopping on here and letting us record this. And I know that there's going to be some of my students who watch this and they're like, oh, yeah, that resonates with what I want to do. So thank you so much, Cynthia.
My pleasure. Really happy to be here with you, April.
Right.